Welcome, dear friends, to a tale of love, deception, and unexpected twists of fate. Enjoy the story. Tom Harrison slammed his suitcase shut, his jaw clenched in frustration. He turned to face his wife, Becky, who lounged on their king-sized bed, scrolling through her phone with disinterest. "That's it, Becky," Tom said, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "I've put up with your antics for far too long, but even my patience has its limits. When I get back from this business trip, we're getting a divorce." Becky's laughter filled the room, sharp and mocking. She tossed her phone aside and fixed Tom with a challenging stare. "Oh, honey," she purred, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're not going to get a divorce that easily, and if you somehow manage it, I'll make sure you're left with nothing but the clothes on your back." Tom's lips curved into a humorless smile. "My dear, your memory seems to be failing you," he said, his tone deceptively calm. "Have you forgotten about our prenup? And what about those videos I wisely recorded when I picked you up from bars, barely conscious? If I show those to the court, you won't see a penny. You might even have to get a real job for once. Given that your diploma was bought and paid for, I'd say your career options are limited. Perhaps janitorial work?" He watched as Becky's face flushed with anger, but he didn't wait for her response. Without another word, Tom grabbed his suitcase and strode out of the house. He climbed into his car and peeled out of the driveway, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. As Tom drove towards the small town where his company had several factories, his mind wandered through the wreckage of his marriage. He had always dreamed of having a beautiful wife, at least 2 kids, a nice house, the whole American dream package. Well, he had the beautiful wife and the house, and his job as a successful businessman provided more than enough money. But children? That dream had never materialized. And now, it seemed, he'd soon be without a wife, too. It was strange to think how Becky had transformed from the sweet, modest girl he'd fallen in love with into this fierce, party-loving woman who seemed to care for nothing but herself. Tom knew he was partly to blame. He had given her too much, too quickly. No need to work, unlimited spending money, constant encouragement to go out and have fun with her friends. He had tried to rein her in when he realized things were getting out of hand, but by then it was too late. The sun was setting as Tom finally reached the outskirts of Millbrook, the small town that housed 3 of his company's factories. He had planned to check into his hotel and start work in the morning, but something made him change his mind. Glancing at his watch, he realized the office should still be open for another 20 minutes or so. "Might as well get a head start," he muttered to himself, steering his car towards the company's local headquarters. The office building loomed ahead, its windows dark save for a few scattered lights. Tom parked his car and made his way inside, nodding to the drowsy security guard who barely acknowledged his presence. As he climbed the stairs to the main office floor, Tom heard the soft swish of a mop. Rounding the corner, he came face to face with a young woman in a cleaner's uniform. She couldn't have been more than 25, with bright eyes and a determined set to her jaw. "Good evening," Tom said, offering a tired smile. The woman jumped, nearly knocking over her bucket of water. She spun to face him, her eyes wide with surprise and a hint of annoyance. "Jesus! Why are you shouting? You scared me half to death!" she exclaimed. Tom, already on edge from his confrontation with Becky, felt his temper flare. "I hardly think 'good evening' qualifies as shouting," he replied coolly. "Where is everyone?" The young woman's posture stiffened, her chin lifting defiantly. "I have no idea where the cleaning supplies are kept in my assigned area, and even if I did, I wouldn't tell you." Tom blinked, taken aback by her response. "I'm sorry, what? I didn't ask about cleaning supplies." "Well, I don't know who you are or how you got in here after hours," she shot back. "For all I know, you could be trying to steal something. I'm calling Mike right now, and he'll throw you out in a heartbeat." Despite his irritation, Tom found himself fighting back a smile. Would that be the same Mike who's currently fast asleep at the security desk downstairs? The woman's cheeks flushed, but her gaze remained defiant. "So what if it is? You think he can't handle you?" Tom had had enough of this bizarre conversation. He turned on his heel and headed for the exit. "Well, he'll certainly have his hands full tomorrow," he muttered as he left. The next day was a whirlwind of activity for Tom. His first order of business was to fire the local director, whose mismanagement had nearly run the company into the ground. Next, he contacted the power company, only to discover that electricity to the factory was about to be cut off due to unpaid bills. Bills that had supposedly been paid according to the reports sent to the head office. Tom spent hours on the phone with the police, explaining the extent of the embezzlement and fraud that had been uncovered. He called in reinforcements from head office, requesting a team of skilled accountants to help untangle the mess. Throughout the day, Tom found himself stepping out of his temporary office periodically, ostensibly to clear his head or grab a coffee. But each time, his eyes scanned the halls, searching for the feisty young cleaner from the night before. To his disappointment, she was nowhere to be seen. As evening approached, Tom found himself alone in the office, with a mountain of paperwork and two of his most dedicated employees. Just as he was about to call it a night, he heard the familiar sound of a mop being dragged across the floor. In a flash, Tom was out in the hallway. But instead of the young woman he'd been half expecting to see, he found himself face to face with an elderly lady in a cleaner's uniform. "Oh, I'm sorry," the old woman said, startled. "Am I disturbing you? I can go clean the other wing if you'd prefer." Tom softened his voice, feeling a twinge of disappointment. No, it's fine. We're just leaving." Back in his temporary office, Tom turned to one of his employees. "Linda, how many cleaners do we have on staff here?" Linda looked thoughtful for a moment. "We have 2 positions, but only one is filled at the moment. Old Mrs. Vasquez has been with us for years. Why do you ask? Did you notice something amiss?" Tom shook his head, his brow furrowed in confusion. "No, nothing's amiss. It's just, last night, there was a young woman cleaning. She couldn't have been more than 25. Linda's face lit up with recognition. "Oh, that must have been Nancy, Mrs. Vasquez's granddaughter. She helps out sometimes when she can. She's a good kid, studying to be a nurse. They've had a tough time lately. Nancy's mom is very ill, and her dad split when things got tough. Nancy and her grandmother are doing their best to keep everything together." Tom listened, fascinated by this glimpse into the young woman's life. It painted her defiant attitude in a whole new light. "She seemed spirited," he said with a small smile. Linda chuckled. "That's one way to put it. Nancy's a fighter, that's for sure. But she keeps her troubles to herself. Doesn't want anyone's pity, I guess." As Tom drove to his hotel that night, he couldn't get Nancy out of his mind. Her strength and determination in the face of such challenges was impressive. It made his own problems with Becky seem petty in comparison. Lost in thought, Tom almost missed the figure that darted in front of his car. He slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. As the car screeched to a halt, Tom found himself staring into the wide, frightened eyes of Nancy, the very woman who had been occupying his thoughts. Tom leaped out of the car, rushing to her side. "Are you okay? What happened?" Nancy blinked, seeming to come back to herself. "Damn," she muttered. Tom's concern quickly turned to anger. "What were you thinking, running into the street like that? Do you have a death wish?" Nancy's eyes flashed. "Look, I need a ride. You can lecture me all you want later, but please, can you drive me somewhere?" Tom was taken aback by her request, but found himself nodding. "Where to?" "The pharmacy, quick as you can," Nancy said, already climbing into his car. As Tom drove, following Nancy's directions, he couldn't help but ask, "What's the emergency?" Nancy's voice was tight with worry. "My mom, she's not doing well. We ran out of her medication and the pharmacy just called to say they got a new shipment in." Tom pressed down on the accelerator, all thoughts of speed limits forgotten. "Just tell me where to go." They reached the pharmacy in record time. Nancy dashed inside, returning minutes later with a small paper bag clutched tightly in her hand. "Can you take me back where you picked me up?" she asked, her voice softer now, tinged with gratitude. As they pulled up to a modest duplex, Nancy turned to Tom. "Thank you. I know I was rude earlier at the office and just now. You really saved me tonight." Tom smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "It's all right. I'm just glad I could help." Nancy hesitated for a moment, then said, "Would you like to come in for a cup of tea? It's the least I can do to thank you." Tom found himself nodding before he could think twice about it. The inside of Nancy's home was small but tidy, with cheerful floral curtains and family photos lining the walls. Tom followed Nancy into the kitchen, where an elderly woman, Mrs. Vasquez, he assumed, was setting out teacups. "Nana, this is—" Nancy trailed off, realizing she didn't know Tom's name. "Tom," he supplied with a smile. "Tom Harrison." Mrs. Vasquez's eyes widened in recognition, and she nearly dropped the teapot she was holding. Nancy looked between them, confusion evident on her face. "Harrison? As in the owner of the company?" Nancy asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and embarrassment. Tom nodded, unable to suppress a chuckle. "The very same. I believe you threatened to have me thrown out of my own building last night." Nancy's face flushed bright red, but to Tom's surprise, she burst out laughing. "Oh God, I can't believe I said that to the big boss. I'm so sorry, Mr. Harrison." "Please call me Tom," he insisted, finding Nancy's laughter infectious. "And don't apologize. It's refreshing to meet someone who isn't afraid to stand up to authority, even if they don't know it's authority they're standing up to." As they settled around the small kitchen table, sipping tea and sharing stories, Tom felt more relaxed than he had in years. Nancy was witty and passionate, her eyes lighting up as she talked about her nursing studies and her dreams for the future. Mrs. Vasquez, once she got over her initial shock, turned out to be a delightful conversationalist, peppering Tom with questions about his life and gently teasing Nancy about her encounter with the big boss. Before he knew it, hours had passed. As Tom prepared to leave, he turned to Nancy. "I know this might sound forward, but would you be willing to show me around town sometime? I've been here so many times for work, but I've never really seen the place." Nancy's smile was warm and genuine. "I'd like that, Tom. I'd like that a lot." As he drove back to his hotel that night, Tom realized that for the first time in months, he hadn't thought about Becky or his impending divorce once all evening. Instead, his mind was filled with Nancy's laugh and the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. Over the next few weeks, Tom found himself extending his stay in Millbrook far beyond what was necessary for work. Every free moment was spent with Nancy, exploring the charming small town and getting to know each other better. They walked through the local park, hand in hand, as Nancy pointed out her favorite spots. "See that old oak tree?" she said, gesturing to a massive tree with sprawling branches. "I used to climb that all the time as a kid. Drove my mom crazy with worry." Tom laughed, squeezing her hand. I can just imagine little Nancy fearlessly scaling that monster of a tree. As they strolled, Tom found himself opening up about his past, his failed marriage, and his doubts about love. To his surprise, Nancy listened without judgment, offering comfort and understanding. "You know, Tom," she said softly, one evening as they watched the sunset from a hilltop overlooking the town, "I used to think that whole soulmates thing was just a myth. But being with you, it makes me wonder if there might be some truth to it after all." Tom felt his heart swell with emotion. He turned to Nancy, cupping her face gently in his hands. "I know exactly what you mean," he murmured, before leaning in to kiss her softly. As their relationship deepened, Tom knew he had to take care of his unfinished business back home. He called his lawyer, instructing him to begin divorce proceedings with Becky. "I should have done this long ago," he told Nancy one day as they picnicked by a lake. "But I'm glad I waited. If I hadn't, I might never have met you." Nancy smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Are you sure about this, Tom? I don't want to be the reason you end your marriage." Tom shook his head firmly. "You're not the reason, Nancy. My marriage was over long before I met you. You're the reason I believe in love again." As Tom's stay in Millbrook stretched into its third month, he and Nancy decided to spend a rare day off together at a nearby amusement park. As they waited in line for the Ferris wheel, Tom's phone buzzed in his pocket. Seeing Becky's name on the caller ID, he frowned. "I should take this," he told Nancy apologetically. "It's Becky. Probably something about the divorce." Nancy nodded understanding, squeezing his hand reassuringly. "Becky?" Tom answered, his voice wary. "Tom, I'm so glad I caught you." Becky's voice came through, uncharacteristically cheerful. "I have amazing news. You might want to sit down for this." Tom's stomach clenched with an inexplicable sense of dread. Just tell me, Becky. What's going on? We're going to be parents, Tom. I'm pregnant. Tom felt as if the ground had dropped out from beneath him. What? Are you sure? Of course I'm sure, silly. Becky laughed. I have my first ultrasound tomorrow. I really want you to be there, Tom. Can you make it back by 2 p.m., please? Tom's mind was reeling. I'll try, he managed to say before hanging up. He turned to Nancy, his face pale. She didn't need to ask to know something was terribly wrong. Nancy, Becky says she's pregnant, Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. Nancy's face drained of color, but she squared her shoulders bravely. Then you need to go back, Tom. I understand. I don't believe in men abandoning their children or pregnant women. Just remember that I love you, okay? And I don't blame you for any of this. Tom felt as if his heart was being torn in two. He watched helplessly as Nancy turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the crowded amusement park. Tom spent the night in a haze of conflicting emotions. By morning he had booked a flight back home, his heart heavy with the thought of leaving Nancy behind. As he drove to the airport, his mind was so preoccupied that he almost missed the old woman hitchhiking by the side of the road. Something made him stop. Maybe it was a need for distraction, or perhaps a subconscious desire to delay his departure. Whatever the reason, Tom pulled over. The old woman climbed into his car, her weathered face breaking into a grateful smile. "Thank you, young man," she said. "Not many people stop these days." As Tom drove, the old woman studied him intently. "You're troubled," she said, her voice filled with concern. "I can see it in your eyes." Tom let out a humorless chuckle. "Is it that obvious?" The old woman nodded sagely. "To those who know how to look, yes. I see more than most, you know. Would you like me to tell you what I see for you?" Tom glanced at her skeptically. "What, like a fortune teller?" "You could call it that," she replied with a mysterious smile. "No charge. You've been kind enough to give me a ride, after all." Tom shrugged, figuring he had nothing to lose. "All right, go ahead." The old woman's eyes seemed to bore into him. "You're heading in the wrong direction, young man. Where you're going, a terrible deception awaits you. A lie that could ruin your entire life if you let it." Tom felt a chill run down his spine. He had entertained doubts about Becky's sudden pregnancy announcement, but had pushed them aside, not wanting to believe she would stoop so low. "What should I do?" he found himself asking. "Don't go," the old woman said simply. "Tell her you're delayed, then go when you're ready, on your own terms." Before Tom could ask any more questions, they had arrived at the old woman's destination. She thanked him and climbed out of the car, leaving Tom alone with his swirling thoughts. In a daze, Tom pulled out his phone and dialed Becky's number. "Becky, I'm sorry, but I can't make it back today. Something's come up at work. I'll be back in a few days." He could hear Becky's frustrated breathing on the other end of the line, but he ended the call before she could protest. Then, following an impulse he couldn't quite explain, Tom turned his car around and headed for the hospital where Becky was supposed to have her ultrasound. Tom arrived at the hospital just as Becky was having a heated argument with a doctor in the hallway. "Give me my money back," Becky was demanding, her face flushed with anger. "My husband didn't show up, so there's nothing to pay for." The doctor looked flustered and angry. "What do you mean, nothing to pay for? You ask me to forge pregnancy documents when you're not even pregnant. Do you realize you're asking me to commit a crime?" Tom stepped forward, a calm smile on his face despite the turmoil he felt inside. "Doctor, I'll pay you 10 times what my wife offered if you'll testify about this at our divorce hearing." Becky whirled around, her face paling as she saw Tom. "Tom, what are you doing here? I thought you said you couldn't make it." Tom ignored her, focusing on the doctor instead. They exchanged contact information before Tom turned and walked out of the hospital, Becky hurrying after him. "Tom, wait! You're just upset right now. We can talk about this," Becky pleaded, grabbing his arm. Tom shook her off, his voice cold. "There's nothing to talk about, Becky. It's over." As he climbed into his car, Tom pulled out his phone and dialed Nancy's number. His heart raced as he waited for her to pick up. "Hello?" Nancy's voice was small and subdued. "Nancy, I'm coming back," Tom said, his voice filled with emotion. She lied to me. Can you believe it? She faked a pregnancy to try and keep me from leaving her. He heard a choked sob on the other end of the line. Oh, Tom, I'm so glad you called. I've missed you so much. I've missed you too, Nancy. More than I can say. I'll be there as soon as I can. We have a lot to talk about. Tom made the drive back to Millbrook in record time, his heart light with the knowledge that he was free to pursue his future with Nancy. When he arrived at her house, she was waiting for him on the porch, her eyes red from crying but a smile on her face. They embraced tightly, both laughing and crying at the same time. Mrs. Vasquez watched from the window, wiping away a tear of her own. Over the next few months, Tom and Nancy's relationship blossomed. Tom finalized his divorce from Becky, selling their lavish house and moving permanently to Millbrook. He took a more hands-on role in managing the local branch of his company, implementing changes that improved working conditions and increased productivity. Nancy continued her nursing studies. With Tom's full support and encouragement, they spent their free time exploring the town, getting to know each other better, and planning for their future together. 1 year after their tumultuous reunion, Tom and Nancy stood in the same doctor's office where Tom had once confronted Becky. But this time, the atmosphere was entirely different. The doctor smiled broadly as he pointed to the ultrasound screen. "Congratulations," he said warmly. "It looks like you're having twins." Tom and Nancy looked at each other, their eyes shining with joy and love. Tom wrapped his arm around Nancy's shoulders, pulling her close. "Twins," he whispered in awe. "Can you believe it?" Nancy laughed, happy tears streaming down her face. "I guess the universe decided to make up for lost time." As they left the doctor's office, hand in hand, Tom marveled at how much his life had changed in just 1 year. He had gone from a loveless marriage and a life that felt empty despite his material success, to finding true love and starting a family with a woman who challenged and inspired him every day. "You know," Nancy said as they walked to their car, "I think that old gypsy woman who gave you a ride that day might have been on to something. It's like the universe conspired to bring us together." Tom chuckled, pulling her close for a kiss. "Well, remind me to thank the universe then, and maybe we should name one of the twins after that old woman just to be safe." Nancy laughed, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Only if you're prepared to saddle our child with a name like Esmeralda or Mystique." As they drove home, planning nursery designs and debating baby names, Tom felt a sense of peace and happiness he had never known before. He had taken an unexpected detour in life, but it had led him exactly where he was meant to be.